Good morning to everybody, if you like. We beginning with this plenary session in the second day. Silence, please. It's now time to welcome our second keynote speaker, Julien Grenet. Julien Grenet is a senior researcher at the Centre National of Recherches Scientifiques, is a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics and deputy director of the Institut des Politiques Publiques. His current research lies at the intersection of the market design and the economics of education and employs various methodological approaches, quasi-experimental approach, research, design, structural estimation, fieldwork, etc. And in recent years, he has undertaken multiple research projects focusing on school choice and student assignment mechanisms, as the presentation of yesterday of Hessel Hosterberg, with a specific emphasis on reforms implemented in France to expand choice in secondary and higher education level. Professor Grenet has an extensive experience in the fields of economic of education, with numerous publications in prestigious journals such as American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economics, American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, the Economics, Arbor Economics, etc., Journal of Public Economics, and among others. In summary, Professor Grenet has a vast amount of experience in our area of interest, the economic of education. Today, he will be speaking on a particular important topic: the effect of social diversity diversity at the school, evidence from a desegregation program. And yesterday, the Professor Osterbeck, in his conclusion, incorporate the idea of the importance of the diversity. And then the Professor Grenet tried to put attention explicitly in this topic, in this factor. In his paper, Professor Grenet investigate whether social desegregation in a school foster social cohesion and reduce social inequality in education outcomes. And then, and with this, I'm concluding with this introduction, and it's for us a great pleasure to present Julien Grenet. Thank you very much to be with us. Thank you, Julien.
Thank you, Mauro. Please stand up. Very kind words. It's really an honor to be here. And I would like to thank the organizers for putting together a really wonderful program, really very interesting. And it's quite an accomplishment, I think, to be have been being around for 32 years. I don't think that many associations are able to show so much persistence. So this is really a fantastic accomplishment. So as you mentioned, Mauro, in a way, this paper echoes a little bit what Hessel hinted about in his presentation, the fact that being exposed to a more diverse student body may change potentially students' perceptions regarding diversity and maybe foster social cohesion. That's one of the goals of desegregation programs. And what I will be presenting today is work in progress about a specific desegregation program that was implemented in France in several municipalities. And this is joint work with several co-authors, Ghazala Azmat, Élise Huillery, Youssef Swidi, and Yann Algan. So the broad motivation for this research, and I think this, in a way, probably also echoes the situation in Spain, the fact that there are very high levels of social segregation in education. In France, this is particularly true in secondary education, and this graph shows you the share of high socioeconomic status students in middle schools, broken down into 10 deciles. So to the left are the 10% most socially disadvantaged school in France, whereas the the bar on the right corresponds to the 10% most advantaged schools. And you can see that there's a pretty big gap. In the lowest decile, there are only 11% high SES students. In the top decile, 3/4 of the students are higher SES. And it's hard to make international comparisons of levels of segregation because the definition of social status varies across countries. So PISA has a measure that is more or less comparable across countries, and it seems, according to this measure, that France actually has pretty high levels, even OECD-wide. So the factors that underline this segregation of schools in the French context, and also this would be the case in most countries where students are assigned to schools based on their residence, on their address, are threefold. So there's, of course, residential segregation. In France, assignment of students to middle schools, to public middle schools, is based on catchment areas. So one address corresponds to one school. There is no school choice in middle schools. School choice exists, but it starts in high school. So that's one factor that mechanically determines a certain amount of segregation if neighborhoods are segregated. But the segregation is higher than that baseline for two reasons. First, students can ask to be assigned to a school, a public school that is not in their district. They can get what we call a dispensation, especially if they attend a specific track like music, dance, some specific language courses. And this could, allow students to, attend a different school. And this contributes to some extent a little bit to segregation, although the contribution is not that big. A larger contribution to segregation is the fact that 21% of middle school students in France attend private schools. And private schools in France, they can select their students freely. There is no regulation of admissions. They don't have catchment areas. And moreover, they are funded mostly by public funds. So 75% of the funding of private schools in France comes from the government. So tuition fees are pretty low by international standards. And so private schools can actually have a relatively high share, internationally. And in big cities, it could go up to 40%. And private school students have mostly high SES students. So why should we care about this issue, segregation issues, as economists? Well, there are at least two big reasons. One is the issue of fairness. Segregation could harm low SES students by, through multiple dimensions. They're lowering their educational outcomes, their aspirations, potentially having long-term negative effects on income, health, crime. However, that depends on, the relative importance of kind of two factors. So that could be what we have in mind generally are negative peer effects that they would suffer from. The fact that by being assigned to more segregated schools, these students have peers of lower ability. They may have teachers with lower experience, access to less resources, and all this would potentially harm them. However, it's also being argued that there could be some positive effects of being in a more homogeneous group if, for example, there are very big negative effects of relative rank. So, if you are a big fish in a small pond, if there is less competition, if you face less competition in your school because you're exposed to less very high achieving students, maybe, you have a better self-esteem, and that may help your performance. So, it's not completely clear-cut. Then the second issue that arises is that of efficiency. The question is, does segregation harm average educational achievement? This is very unclear given the current evidence because it really depends on how we think typically of the form of peer effects. If we think that, for example, peer effects are linear in means, that means that segregation could, for low SES students, they could be harmed by being in the segregated school, but that would at the same time help the high SES students. So desegregation would just reduce inequalities without necessarily raising the average educational outcome. So it's not clear whether desegregation would lead to a lose-lose situation, a win-win situation, or the zero-sum game. And it really depends on how symmetric or asymmetric the effects of segregation are. So that's one of the issues that we have in mind while working on this topic. And the starting point of this paper was a school desegregation initiative that was launched in, towards the end of 2015, where the French Ministry of Education launched an initiative across several municipalities to experiment different means to reduce segregation in public schools, and public middle schools specifically. The two objectives of this program were, first, to reduce social inequality in educational outcomes, but that was not the only goal. The other goal was also to foster social cohesion. The idea that if you separate kids at a very early age, that's going to harm cohesion in society. It could have adverse effects on solidarity, civic values, tolerance, and it is the actual program was launched soon after terrorist attacks that took place in Paris, and there was one of the arguments that was made at the time was that actually some of the terrorists that perpetuated the crimes were actually, when you look back at their own schooling, they had been in extremely segregated schools in Paris. So the way this worked was really a bottom-up approach where the ministry asked local education authorities, both districts and schools, to propose some actions, different ways in which we could reduce segregation, rather than a top-down approach where the ministry would say, this is how you're going to do it. So there were several approaches that were implemented, and a scientific committee was set up to evaluate the interventions, and including both economists and sociologists, so more quantitative and qualitative studies. So we were more on the quantitative side. So the two research questions of this paper are, first, well, how effective was this desegregation initiative at actually increasing social diversity in schools? Did it succeed? So what were the actions taken by the municipalities? How did families respond? That's an important question, of course, because you could think, well, maybe if you attempt to desegregate schools, some high SES families are going to move to private schools, and ultimately this would reduce the net effect of the program. And ultimately, what was the effect of this program on social diversity, not only at the school level, but within the classrooms and among friendship networks? So this is a very important question that we try to answer using survey data, because it is not completely clear that it is enough to increase social diversity at the school level to change the interactions that kids have together depending on their social background. Because we may think that there is a strong, some degree of homophily in friendship formation, and if you are high SES students, maybe more likely to make high SES friends, even if your school becomes more diverse. The second question we try to answer is, well, how does more diversity in school affect actually the outcomes of high SES and low SES students? And here we try to take a really broad approach by not only considering educational outcomes, and of course we look at the effects on student performance, on absenteeism, on discipline, but we also try to broaden the set of outcomes to include non-academic outcomes, such as measures of personal well-being at school, academic self-esteem of the students, growth mindset, optimism, these measures that are actually known to actually potentially matter a lot for long-term outcomes, as well as what we call social well-being, where we measure how students feel about the climate in the school, how they feel about the quality of their relationship with friends, with teachers, their social attitudes, their social fatalism, these dimensions that can only be measured through survey data. And the strategy that we use to answer these questions is to basically match the schools that were involved in this desegregation program with a control group of similar non-treated schools. And in both groups, treated control, we follow students from grade 6 to grade 8, to grade 9 currently, so throughout middle school. And we combine administrative data with survey data to measure the effects on student perceptions, attitudes, in addition to educational outcomes. So in the interest of time, I'll probably be brief about this, the literature we speak to, but broadly speaking, this paper is related to a pretty large literature on school desegregation that has mostly focused on desegregation programs in the US, mostly race-based desegregation programs, such as busing and the end of busing. Most of these papers provide evidence on educational outcomes, potential labor market outcomes, much less evidence on the effects of desegregation on social emotional outcomes. We also, of course, speak to the literature on peer effects, where here the peers have changed not through just between cohort variation in the composition of the ability composition of a class, but rather a policy-induced change. And the policy was this desegregation initiative. We focus on the effects of social mixing on intergroup relations. There's a growing literature on this that is, however, mostly focused on non-school contexts, like college dorms, in the army, in the workplace. Here we focus on intergroup relations in school. And as you will see, we think that it is important to consider relative rank effects whenever you think about desegregation policies, because that's one channel through which these policies could affect students' self-esteem. And we will see that we believe that that's one channel that could explain some rather surprising findings that we have in our paper about how the self-esteem of high SES students changes when you implement desegregation policy. So I will give you some background on some brief institutional background about both school system in France and the policy. Talk about the research, design, and data, and then move to the results. So a bit of background, very briefly, this diagram summarizes the school system in France, the education system in France. So students attend 5 years of elementary school, then move to middle school, which lasts 4 years from grade 6 to grade 9. And all this is just a unique track. And then tracking starts in high school, where about a third of the students go to vocational education, while another 2/3 go to general track. So we, in this paper, are focusing on middle schools. And importantly, there are two measures of performance that we can rely on that are national tests. One is the test that students take when they enter grade 6. It's a standardized test in French and math. And then there's this national exam that all students take at the end of grade 9. So we're going to use both of this in addition to the grades that we collected, the grades that kids get, the GPA in the school, which of course is not directly comparable across schools because grading practices may be different. So the desegregation initiative we focused on was launched in November 2015, and it involves 22 so-called pilot sites that implemented actions that started either in 2016 or 2017. In total, 56 middle schools were involved, and in each of these sites, there were 2 to 6 public middle schools in the program. There was not a single type of action that was implemented, but we can distinguish more like 5. The 5 types of actions that were implemented are following a more classic approach, which is to redraw the catchment areas. The idea here is that you could redraw catchment areas in a way to achieve a better balance between the socioeconomic composition of each catchment area to then influence the composition of schools. That was done in several of these sites. Another approach was to close down very segregated schools and relocate the students to more socially advantaged schools, typically in the center of the city. Then another approach was to merge the catchment areas of several schools, typically 2, and then assign the students to either of the schools. So typically you would merge the catchment areas of schools which had very different social composition. And then there were 2 ways in which students would be assigned, and I'll explain how this worked. One is a classic kind of school choice approach with social quota. The other is so-called alternate assignment. It's hard to explain with words. It's easier with a diagram, so I'll show you how this works. And another final approach was consisted in introducing very attractive elective courses in deprived school so as to attract or retain high SES students, because high SES parents value these kind of attractive elective courses, such as music options or international options, some rare languages, and that was one way to achieve this. So this table shows you all the sites that were involved. What I want to highlight here is it's not like every site implemented a single action. In many cases, it was more a combination. For example, you could close a school, but if you're going to close a school, this will mechanically change the school catchment areas, because that school's gone, so you have to change the catchment areas. Sometimes also school choice was implemented together with the introduction of attractive courses to, for example, if you introduce school choice between two schools and one school already has an attractive option and the other doesn't, it's better to create a new attractive option to create a balance. So that's something that was done. So it's hard to, and we don't have the statistical power to achieve this, to really measure how each approach was more or less effective. Clearly here we're going to look at the combination of all these potential means. It's harder to really say much about this is, for example, redrawing of catchment areas is ineffective as opposed to school choice. So just to illustrate how, this was implemented, for example, in Paris. Paris has 4 of the pilot sites out of 22. This map shows the social composition, more or less the share of low SES students in all of the 120-something public middle schools in Paris. Red color means very deprived school, blue is less deprived school. What's interesting out of this map is you can see that segregation occurs at a very fine spatial level. So if you look, for example, at this arrondissement here, 18th arrondissement, this is Montmartre, you have schools that are very close by, like 150 meters apart, where one school would be very deprived by national standards, while the other public school here is very socially advantaged. This means that it's possible potentially to influence the composition of schools by changing assignment methods, because this means that, well, underlying this, there are different neighborhoods with different composition. So you could probably, by saying introducing school choice, redrawing catchment areas, you can change, you can affect the composition of each school. So the 4 pilot sites that were set up in Paris are the following. Here, it illustrates 3 ways of doing this. Here, in this zone, the catchment areas of these 3 schools were redrawn to achieve better balance. And these 3 zones here involve the introduction of school choice, not school choice, merging of catchment areas. So in each of these zones, there were 2 catchment areas that were merged. This school here introduced alternate assignment, while these schools here in these multi-school districts, students were assigned to the schools based on a school choice system with quotas. So let me explain how this works. This would be the classic way in which students are assigned to middle schools in Paris, in France. So if you live in catchment area A, you go to school A. If you live in catchment area B, you go to school B. That's how it works in many countries. Alternate assignment works in the following way. You merge the 2 catchment areas, and instead of students from this zone going to school A and these students from this going to school B, in, say, year T, all students from both catchment areas, they start school in school A. In the following year, and they will stay in this school throughout middle school. The following year, all students are assigned to school B, and they will stay in that school throughout. This means that, say, instead of having 4 classes of grade 6 students, you have 8. And this means that these, if the two areas are very socially polarized, then this means you're going to have more diversity in the school. And after a transition period, you get this system where each school has only 2 grade levels instead of 4, and they alternate every second year. So that's one approach that was taken. The other approach in the other 2 districts here was the introduction of a school choice mechanism where parents would be asked to rank the two schools by order of preference. And then the students would be divided into 4 social groups based on their parents' socioeconomic status. This was then used to set up quotas in each of the 2 schools to match the social composition at the district level. And then for each of the quota, the assignment was performed using the deferred acceptance mechanism that Hessel mentioned yesterday in a controlled fashion, so controlled deferred acceptance, where you take into account the preferences of the parents, but then the students are assigned according to the quotas that were set for each category. And the priority rules that were used in addition to the quotas were students with disabilities had priority, then students who had already a sibling in the school, and then a lottery was used. Okay, so this was one way to desegregate the schools. So generally speaking, there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in the schools that were in the pilot sites, the 22 pilot sites that were involved in the program. This diagram shows you for the most deprived and the least deprived school in each site, so the most deprived is in red, the blue, the least deprived school, the share of low SES students in the school. So what this highlights is that, well, in some sites, the most deprived school was like among the most deprived in France, while in other sites it would be more like average. Well, you also have very socially advantaged schools in some of the sites where in other sites, you know, the most socially advantaged school is actually not that socially advantaged nationwide. So in fact, if you dig deeper, what we realized is that some of the districts actually didn't have that much potential for desegregation because the schools that were put together, that were involved, were pretty similar to start with, okay? And that's going to be an important factor to take into account, explaining the research design that we implemented. So not all schools, not all sites that were involved actually had that much potential to desegregate. So how do we, what research design did we implement? So we had these 22 pilot sites that were involved in and implemented one of the different means to desegregate. And for each of these sites, we create a control group, a comparison site, using a nearest neighbor matching approach. So the way we did this was to, for each pilot site, we would start by finding all possible combinations. So say the site has 3 schools, we would find all possible combinations of 3 schools that would respect the following property. They were in the same education district or adjacent education district, so they're not too far away geographically. They were not involved in a desegregation program, and they were in the same type of municipality as the pilot site. So if it's a rural pilot site, we want a rural comparison group. And we want the distance between the schools in that combination to not exceed that in the pilot site. So that, you know, if the schools are very close by, we want a group of 3 schools that are also close by. And then, you know, that leaves us with many possibilities. How do we pick the control group for a given pilot site? We select the combination of schools that minimizes a criterion, a distance criterion, where we want these schools to have similar characteristics as those in the pilot site. So we looked at the characteristics of schools in the pre-experiment period in terms of social composition, student performance, the gaps between the schools, in a way to really try to find the best possible match for a given pilot site. And we end up with 22 comparison groups. This map shows you where the treated and control sites are located. So the blue are the treated sites, the red are the control groups. So generally we try to find them in the same education district, but sometimes the best possible match was in a neighborhood district. And for example, in Paris, I showed you the 4th pilot site. Well, the control sites are kind of also, they were picked up by this procedure to be also schools on the outskirts of Paris, but on the other side of the city. So the question then is, how good is this comparison group? So what we looked at was before anything happened, before the program was implemented, how did the measures, how does this segregation compare and evolve between the treated and control sites? So here we use a very simple measure of segregation, which is what the so-called exposure measure. Exposure means, for example, for randomly picked low SES students in a site, what is the share of high SES students in this student's school? Okay, what is the exposure of low SES students to high SES students in their school? So here it means, well, before the experiment took place in the treated and control site, the typical low SES student had 32, 33% high SES students in the school. And this is the same thing reversed. This is the share, the exposure of high SES students to low SES students. So as you can see, the trends are pretty nicely aligned before. And the question then is, well, what happened after? So did desegregation occur? Did the program actually reduce segregation or here increase exposure of one group to another? So it did. You can see that in the pilot site, there was more exposure of each group to the other group with an effect of about 3 to 5 percentage points. However, you know, it's relatively modest. It's not like a huge change. And this, you know, raises the question of, you know, why was that the case? So one possibility is that, well, maybe some parents following the initiative decided to enroll their kids, high SES parents would enroll their kids in private schools. That would kind of partially at least cancel the effect. Another possibility is the kind of white flight phenomenon where parents would simply move out of these districts, high SES parents. That would also affect exposure measures. So we don't actually find any evidence of either explanation. So here this plot shows you, so the red area shows the share of students in the pilot and control sites who attend private schools, and we don't see any differential evolution here. Actually, it's also the same if we zoom into for low SES students, for high SES students, nothing really is happening here. Nor do we see a change in the social composition of the kids who reside in these sites. So if there was white flight following the experiment, you would expect, for example, the social composition of the neighborhood to deteriorate after the experiment because high SES parents would be moving out of the district when the kids reach middle school age. So we don't see any evidence of that. Actually, the trends are very aligned in the treated and in the pilot sites and the control sites. So given that, you know, there's an effect, but it's not a very big first stage. So given that effect, it's not that easy to argue that we're going to be able to measure the effect of desegregation on outcomes. So if we want to actually move on to the second research question, which is how does social diversity in school affect the outcomes of kids, we have to find a way to get a bigger first stage. And the way we do this is, so before that, I should explain why actually the average effect was so low. Well, it's related to the fact that the initial gap between schools was limited in about half of the site. There was not so much potential for desegregation. Maybe that relates to political economy reasons where, you know, in some districts, you know, to avoid political turmoil, they would say, oh, we have great schools to be involved, to participate in an experiment, but it turns out they're not that different. And no surprise, you know, it's not going to create a lot of tension locally because the schools are pretty close to start with. In Paris, for example, where some of the schools involved were very socially polarized, there was, you know, some parents actually protested very loudly against this by, you know, demonstrating in front of the city town hall to protest against the program. So the way we try to circumvent the issue is to focus on the sites and the students for which we can argue that there was actually a big potential for change. That basically there was scope for more diversity. It could happen if you reassign the students differently. So the way we do this is to control what we call, construct a measure called the exposure gap. This gap is kind of, intuitively, it's measuring, take a student, we want to measure how far this student's exposure to the other social group was from a situation where the students would be randomly allocated to school. That measures kind of the potential. We say, we take as a counterfactual a situation where in the site all the students would be mixed together. How much exposure would that kid get if it was if we randomly assign students, as compared to the actual exposure of the students to, say, high SES. And we do this using pre-reform data and using specifically the information on the elementary school where the students are enrolled, because that's a very good predictor of their exposure. Some elementary schools, turn out to predict very well segregation in middle schools, so we use that. And using this measure, we basically selected 10 sites out of the 22 that had the highest potential for change. And within each site, we focus on 50% of the students who individually are predicted to have the biggest potential for change. So that's a way to kind of really zoom into the groups, only using pre-reform data that are more likely to be affected by the program. So that's a measure of the exposure gap. So these students to the right here are those who are who were exposed, who were really the most segregated to start with, and we focus on the students with the highest predicted segregation before the reform, and we follow them over time. So then we rely on two types of data. Administrative and survey data. So the administrative data we obtain from the French Ministry of Education, and it is quite rich in the sense that it covers all the universe of students with information, pretty detailed information on their social background, and we use this to classify students into two groups, low and high SES. You can think of low SES students as students whose parents typically would not have a college university education, and high SES students as students whose parents have a college education. But this is based on occupation. We have measures of academic performance. So we have, I showed you earlier in the diagram, at the entrance, when students enter middle school, grade 6, so that's before anything happens to them in middle school. At the end of middle school, grade 9 exam. And we also collect the information on their performance in the school as graded by the teachers. We also collected directly from the school measures of absences, lateness, disciplinary sanctions. That's important if we want to measure the effects of desegregation on, say, these behavioral outcomes. All this is available for all students that we are interested in here. We complemented this information with survey data that we collected for two cohorts of students who entered grade 6 either in 17 or in 18. And we followed these students for 9 years, but we had two surveys, one at the end of grade 6 and one at the end of grade 8. Okay, we have two collection points. Unfortunately, and as echoes also what SL faced, COVID hit, as we know, and we could not perform the second data collection point for the second cohorts, because that happened right in COVID, although we were able to get all the other measures from the schools, and including their performance, but not the survey. Here, what we do is we actually, we randomly assign the tablets to perform two types of surveys. We had the kid take standardized tests in math and French. And we collected measures, we asked them questions to construct indices of personal well-being. So we asked them about their self-esteem, for example, their academic self-esteem, whether they, for example, growth mindset, which is measuring whether they think that if they make more efforts, they will be rewarded, they can achieve higher performance, locus of control. We asked them about how they feel about safety at school, the quality of the relationships with their friends, the teachers, trust. And then we ask a number of questions about social attitudes regarding cooperation. For example, do you rather work in a team than not? Pro-sociality, like I like to be kind to others, these kind of questions. Tolerance, with respect to ethnicity and gender, and measures of solidarity, which is more like asking them, for example, if should society pay for the hospital treatment of people who cannot afford this? Okay, this is more broader, it's not regarding their own personal situation. And we asked every kid to nominate up to 5 friends in the class. So every kid was shown a tablet with the names of all the other kids and said, who are your friends? Pick up to 5. This is not available for all students because we not survey all the classrooms, but it's available for random subsamples of the target students. Okay, so the baseline specification that we use is pretty standard in the sense that we basically compare the students in the treated and control sites, which are indicated by this dummy variable D. We control for a number of baseline individual and school level covariates. We perform the comparison because we do this pairwise comparison. We match each pilot site to a control site, so we include pair of site fixed effects. So every treated site is matched with its control site. And we include year fixed effect because we're considering different cohorts. Because we consider so many outcomes, of course, there could be an issue about multiple hypothesis testing. So we complement the usual p-values with p-values that are adjusted for multiple hypothesis testing. So we have these Q values here in addition. Okay, so let me move to the results. First thing to check, of course, is do we have a good balance between the treated and control sites based on the number of observables? If we do not, that's a bit worrying for the strategy. So here we perform the balancing test for the 2 groups of interest, that is the low SES students. Again, remember, these are not all the low SES students in the sites. They're the low SES with the 50% of low SES with the highest predicted change, exposure change. Same thing for high SES. And we compare these characteristics across the treated and control sites. So first thing to note is that the low SES and high SES students in our sample, they're pretty different, okay? So for example, if you look at the share of these kids who have single parents, who are in single parents household, it's 17% for the low SES, 5% for the high SES. 11% of the low SES have ever repeated in elementary school, 2% only of the high SES. And one of the potentially largest gap is performance. So this is measured in percentile rank. So the gap between the high and the low SES is 30 percentile ranks on the national scale. So it's a pretty big difference. Now, if we look at the treated control groups, treated control comparison, the samples are well balanced. We don't find any significant differences here. This is also true if we consider another type of balancing test. It is, in addition to comparing the kids themselves, their individual characteristics, we want to compare the schools they came from, the elementary school, the kind of environment they were exposed to elementary school. And we can see that, well, these kids had very different environments in elementary school. So the low SES kids, 28% of them were enrolled in a priority education school. That's a specific program designed to that targets the most deprived schools in France and get extra resources. None of the high SES were in these schools. The students in their school had a much larger share of students who had repeated, who were in single parents household, 24% against 14, or who were getting a scholarship, for their parents were getting financial aid from the school, 39 versus 12. So again, there's only a single difference here that's significant at 10%, but that's expected given the nominal level. Okay, so based on this, if we compare these 2 groups of high and low SES students in these sites where we can expect the program to have a bigger effect, then indeed we do find that the shock in the exposure is much bigger. So here, we find a much larger impact on exposure rates than in the full sample. It's about 10 to 13 percentage points. So it's really economically meaningful. Typically for low SES students, they would have 20% higher SES in their school. this has jumped in the pilot sites to 35%. So, we can think of this as a substantial difference, and we also find a change for the high SES exposure to low. Okay, first question is, did this actually, this increased diversity at the school level translate into more diversity in the classroom and among friends? The reason why the diversity in the classroom could be lower is if you think, for example, that school principals, they may counteract the effect of diversity by, for example, tracking the students based on selection of specific courses, and that may partially cancel the effects on diversity. So here we compare the effects, the impact of the program on the exposure rates at the school level and within the classroom, and we find that it's pretty similar. So in other terms, the diversity that was achieved in the school was also achieved in the classroom. And now when we look at the effect on friendships networks, well, we do find a significant effect for both groups. It's actually more significant for the high, but it is lower than what you would expect if students would be randomly making friends in their classroom or their school. Okay, because this is in a way expected. There is a certain degree of homophily in friendship formation, and this then means that you don't get the same level, the same increase in diversity if you consider friends as opposed to classroom level observations. But we do find this effect. So the desegregation led to more socially diverse networks, and from now on, instead of presenting things in the form of a table, which is not always easy to follow, I will show this in the effects in the form of a diagram, which reads as following. The red kind of symbols are for the low SES, the blue ones are for the high SES, and every time I show the baseline level in the control group, and the arrow points to where the direction of the effects, okay? So this is the same results as here. It's showing that the level of diversity at the school level, class level, and friendship level converge. No, there's less segregation to a lesser extent among friends than at the school level. But you can see that the gap between these kids' exposure was about halved by the program. This is substantial. So the exposure gap was halved. Now, next we move to the effects of the program of this increase in diversity on academic outcomes. Now, here we don't find anything, okay? We do not find any significant positive effects for the low SES, neither do we find positive or significantly negative effects for the high SES. It is, in a way, not completely surprising, given the literature on peer effects, which suggests that these peer effects on academic outcomes are of moderate size, and but in a way, the positive news is that one big concern that was expressed about this, that is expressed about this desegregation program, is that it could have very big adverse effects for the high SES students. That's one reason why the high SES parents oppose these programs. We do not find evidence of that. So the high SES were not harmed by being exposed to more low SES. However, the low SES, their performance did not increase significantly either. Where we do find, so before I move to the non-academic outcomes, I should also highlight that in terms of school behavior, we don't find anything either. In terms of lateness, absences, sanctions, nothing significant. Although, the baseline levels were pretty different, right? Low SES students are much more likely to be exposed to be absent, late, to be sanctioned at school, but that didn't really change. An important dimension to keep in mind before I move to the non-academic outcomes is that although there's no effect on absolute performance, relative performance is mechanically impacted by desegregation programs. Why? Well, if I'm a low SES student and I am moved to a high SES school, my relative performance is going to be lower in that receiving school. So my relative rank is mechanically lowered by the fact that I'm exposed to a peer group of higher average ability. And this is indeed what we find. The relative rank of high SES students is higher in the pilot sites, while that of the low SES is significantly lower. And basically it's about 5 to 10 percentile ranks. So there is a change in the relative performance, and this could matter for how students perceive their own performance, their academic self-esteem. And I think this is one plausible explanation to what we find when we look at non-academic outcomes. So here we have created these very broad indices to try to summarize the findings. We group the items into 3 main groups. Measures of personal well-being, social well-being, and social attitudes. I will detail what each indice includes, but what we do find in general is that the program had positive effects on high SES measures of personal well-being. It had positive effects for the low SES social well-being, and for both groups had positive effects on social attitudes. So as opposed to the effects on academic outcomes, which are not significant here, we do find some effects. So looking at these measures of personal well-being, the big thing that changes is that for the high SES, their academic performance self-esteem is very much increased. So they perceive themselves as much better in the pilot group than in the control group, and we can think of this as consistent with the fact that their relative rank is indeed higher. So that was not completely expected in the sense that this is a potentially positive effects for high SES of being exposed to a more diverse body, is that they could feel that they're a bigger fish in a smaller pond. We do find that for both types of students, they are more likely to think that efforts are rewarded in the sense that we ask them if, for example, if I make more efforts at school, I will be more likely to succeed. And this is something that seems to be affected positively by the program. For the low SES students, most of the effects on non-academic outcomes concern this the kind of social well-being. They feel safer at school, and they feel that the quality of their relationship with friends is better, okay, in the pilot group. So this is one of the major findings here, is that the students feel that the environment in which they evolve is both safer and conducive to higher quality relationships. And finally, we look at the social attitudes of the students, and we try to measure different ways in which this could affect their perception. So we asked them about cooperation. Cooperation is like, I like working as a team rather than working alone. Pro-social behavior, we asked them whether, for example, they try to be nice to their other kids. We asked them about optimism about social mobility. So here the question is like, to what extent do you think that your parents' diploma or neighborhood matter for long-term outcomes? So it's kind of the reverse of social fatalism. And we also asked them about tolerance with respect to ethnic diversity. Like, it is okay to marry someone who is not from your ethnic group, or it's okay for an employer to discriminate. So these kind of questions. We asked similar questions for gender, and overall what we find is that for both groups, not necessarily exactly on the same outcomes, and mostly for the low SES, we find positive effects on these measures. So the low SES students are more likely to show pro-social behavior, to be less fatalistic about social mobility, more tolerant about ethnic diversity, which is, we were a bit surprised that, that there's such a big gap to start with. So low SES students tend to be less tolerant than the high SES in this survey, and they are positively affected here. So to conclude, what do we find at this stage of the paper? That first, social segregation between schools can be reduced. Here there were multiple local actions that were taken. Of course, a precondition for this to occur is that the schools should be different to start with. Okay, so here, in about half of the sites, there was a substantial effect on social diversity that was achieved through these different means, school choice, a redesign of catchment areas, closing of deprived schools. In the time period we consider of 3 years, we do not find sizable white flight effects into private schools or changes in the social composition of the network, of the neighborhood. And we find that this increased diversity in the school translates into increased diversity into the classroom and also among friends, although among friends, the effect is not as large. For high SES students, we don't find adverse effects on academic performance, but we do find gains in academic self-esteem. For the low SES, we don't find significant improvements in their performance, but there are positive effects on several measures of social well-being and social attitudes. So in a way, we don't find any evidence of welfare losses in the short run. The fact that we don't find effects on academic performance suggests that these kind of measures are not sufficient to reduce short-run inequalities in educational performance. However, there may be larger gains in the longer run that would be determined by these non-academic outcomes that are improved here. And what may hint to this is the fact that there's recent research, for example, conducted by Racchetti and co-authors, showing that friendship networks that you make in school are one of the most powerful predictors of social upwards mobility in adulthood. And they show this using Facebook data in the US, and that the share of high SES students among your friends in school, if it were for the low SES to be aligned with that of the high SES, it would predict an increase of 20% in adult income. So this is one mechanism through which these changes in non-academic outcomes could have long-run effects, although, of course, within this research, we cannot yet measure long-run effects. We'll have to wait a couple of years before we can see anything on, for example, higher education outcomes. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions, if any.
Thank you very much, Julien, for your very, very interesting presentation and very, very interesting conclusion and results, no, about the effect of the non-cognitive skills, about the reduction of the segregation. No? And then I think that surely you will be very, very interesting question for the audience. Please, Luis.
It's very interesting, this.
Yes.
This article. And my question is, this policy, I don't remember if you have... How many years have been...
No. One moment, Luis.
How many...
No, with this. It's not... No. Change the micro. Olvídate.
Yes, my question is a very interesting article, and my question is, how many years has been this policy has been developed? I suppose that it's a centralized policy for the government of France, or is a regional policy. And what do you think about if this policy could be changed because of the elections in 2 days? How do you think about that?
So, interesting question. Thank you. So, this policy has been set up back in, it was launched in 15, but implemented either in 16 or 17. Then actually there were later initiatives in 18 that we could not follow with data, but it has been in place. My understanding is that at least for the sites we have followed and predicted to be the ones that had the biggest potential, they have been preserved. So it continues to take place. Now, it has not been expanded. So there was a change in the Ministry of Education changed, and the new one that came in was not as kind of keen to reduce segregation, was not the top priority. And so, for example, the pilot sites in Paris, initially, they were there to kind of to be tested for 3 years, and if it was proved to be effective, they were supposed to be multiplied in Paris, and they were not. So we have 3, and there have been 3 ever since it started. And in terms of, so this was implemented at the regional level, but you know, the focus of the Ministry of Education kind of shifted away from this social mixing priority, and I am not very confident that it will change in the future if, well, it depends on the outcome of the election, but clearly the far right doesn't really support very much these kind of programs, and they are likely to, you know, be at least 50% of parliaments on Sunday. So this is, you know, a little bit worrying for these programs. Now, there is quite a lot of education depends to some extent on local authorities. And so some local authorities, especially like the city of Toulouse, has been pretty proactive to, independently of national kind of initiatives, to continue implementing these programs. So I think they can survive at a local level, but there will be no national framework, I don't think, for a while. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. You said at the beginning that the determiner of the socioeconomic status of the students is their parents' academic background, right? So how about the effect of their income, their wealth, because there are at least 10 other elements in socioeconomic status? That's my first question. And my second question is that for schools, the rankings for better schools, or I don't want to say better or worse schools, but different levels of schools were the neighborhood and the ranking of the school educationally, right? So how did you match? At the beginning, you used the matching. Yeah. So I want to see specifically how did you match these?
So in terms of the social status of the students, so it's really based on this measure of this classification of occupation in France, but it's not only occupation. So the Ministry of Education using a pretty fine disaggregated level of occupations, and they are grouped not only based on, say, average income, which would be like economic capital, but also on how predictive these occupations are of the kids' success in school. So to give you an example, teachers, they are not very high in the income distribution, but they are considered as high SES based on the measure of the Ministry of Education, because their kids of teachers do very well in school. So it is a kind of composite way of measuring background as it is predictive of performance and success in school. So it's a little bit of a combination of income and what we call in France cultural capital. Yeah. Job security, but the way they did it basically was to look at occupations, how the average performance of the kids from these different occupations, and then group them into 4 categories that don't overlap in terms of average performance of the kids. So in general, it kind of makes sense. You would have, CEOs, managers, university professors in the very top. At the bottom would be people without an occupation, blue-collar workers. But there are some classifications that are not completely aligned with income, like teachers, for example. And in terms of the how we match the schools, the pilot and control sites, we used measures of average academic performance of the students in the school, which is not a measure of value added, it's really just a peer composition. In terms of academic performance, social background, as well as the gaps between the schools. So for example, if we had a site with 3 schools that were, very polarized, we would try to find a site that has the same polarization between the schools. So it's a kind of, it's it's a distance measure, a sum of squares of gaps between these different criteria. And then when we look at the, we check that, whether it makes sense. So in general, it's really, pretty closely aligned because there are many ways in which you can combine close by schools to try to map these pilot sites. Thank you for your question.
More questions?
Hi, myself, I have like more than a question, just a comment, because I also work, I usually work on educational equality, so I'm very concerned about student status and how we define student status. And I was following the question of our mate, and from my point of view, what is important is not like the money, it's the information that the students have for taking decisions. That I think is related to the capital status, capital, what we call it. I think it from
Cultural capital.
Yeah,
It comes from Bourdieu.
Yeah, exactly, because I have a paper like that is very recently discussed about this basically information and the contacts. I don't know.
Yes. This classification is based on these indicators, but it is also of performance of the kids, but of course it relates to a lot of sociological research showing how the information set of parents is very different across these occupations. Again, a good example is teachers. They're not high in the income distribution, but they have first quality information about the schools, and the education system in general that helps their kids to navigate in the system. And that's one, occurrence of this. So I think it is very important indeed not to restrict to one dimension. In any case, we do not have a measure of parental income in the data, so we have this. The closest measure to income is we know whether kids get this scholarship. It would be like in other countries, free school meals. That's another measure. The thing is, it would isolate a very deprived group of kids. So it's a group that is a bit too small to have a balanced sample. So in the end we chose to use this this kind of SES classification.
In any case, also, for example, in PISA, they don't have Hola, now it's working. Also in PISA, they don't have information about income, but they have the ESCS index that is quite popular indeed.
The measure is quite similar to that. What we use is quite similar to this ESCS. I can't remember how it's called.
Yeah, ESCS, exactly, yeah.
It's a similar, it's not like a single dimension. It's multi-dimensional summary of what matters for predicting student performance.
Thank you.
More questions? Yes? Don-Soo, please.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Julien, for a very interesting research and presentation. I'm actually having two questions. One is about the increased self-esteem for high SES students. What do you think the mechanism or channel it might be? Relating to this, I was wondering how the school teachers are responding to these kind of social mixing, changing of the student population. So, would they play a role in really helping the students changing their social behavior or attitudes towards each other? And it could be that they praise the students. Could be that because they're from high SES, they have better academic background, and which could help with their self-esteem. So this is one of my thinking, what about the teacher side, how they change their behavior. And the second, I noticed that in one of your slides, you show there is actually a big gain for the low SES students in terms of their friendship or somewhat.
Quality of friendship.
Yeah, friendship. And I think you also survey about the top 5 friends. So you must know who are their top 5 friends, right? And somehow also I think that at the very beginning you're saying that the friends level, the magnitude is the smallest in one of those 3 different dimensions. So I was wondering, if it could be that these are kind of like they probably know that they're probably the different, I mean, sort of like very similar group. If their friends are very, of their very similar socioeconomic background, they feel more united in a way, and that can contribute to some of these outcomes that you were.
Yes,
finding,
so maybe on the first question, the teachers, that's a very interesting dimension. I think it's very important. I think Hessel had mentioned that too. It's we can't. This is a composite treatment. This desegregation program. We shouldn't think of it necessarily as being only a change in peer composition. All sorts of things change when you change students. They get maybe different teachers. They could be a bit further away from home. So it's hard, but that's kind of the essence of any desegregation program. So we are measuring this reduced form. Now, in terms of teachers, what we did look at is, for example, are they exposed to teachers with different levels of experience, different types of contracts, different levels of education? There's not much going on. The teachers are pretty similar. Now, it is possible that the teachers have reacted differently. So, unfortunately, we don't have really any measure of that. We did ask the ministry to share the information on the teacher side to measure one dimension, is teacher turnover. And do we see teachers, because there's anecdotal evidence that in some of these schools the teachers were unhappy and they moved away and asked to shift to another school. So this is one dimension we can explore, whether increasing school diversity may endogenously change teacher composition by determining mobility. So that's one thing we can do, but that's the only one. And then the second question is this friendship effects. So in fact, we actually we're working on a companion paper to explore, to use this data on friendship much more intensively, because indeed, there's many more things you can do with this network analysis. So we're working with economists that are more specialists than we are of, economics of networks. So Yann Bramoulet is one of them. And so what we try to look at in more detail is how the diversity really affects the structure of networks. To precisely answer questions says like more, for example, homophily. Your friendship networks could change because you have a diverse pool to pick up from, but you may become more homophilic because there's an in-group protection. And this can be measured with a kind of Oaxaca blinder style decomposition, when you try to measure how there's, if students had the same propensity to make friends with the students from the other group, if you kept it fixed, what would be the effects on friendship? And you compare this with reality, and that may suggest that, in fact, if it's lower, that in fact they became more homophilic in a way to protect themselves. So we are looking at that, and the only preliminary information I can give is that we see this happening the first year when they're in grade 6. Clearly, they become more homophilic, and this kind of disappears. And when they get into grade 8, in fact, this is gone. So it looks like there's a kind of in-group mechanism, and then it kind of vanishes. And so that's something we will try to explore more. Thank you very much, Zongshu, for your question.
Last question, please.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. Now, with this paper and also something that we've seen with Hessel Osterbeck and maybe some other papers as well, there's sort of emerging this consensus that these desegregation policies may not affect the academic outcomes very much, barely any, whereas there might be some positive effects on non-academic outcomes. Now, I think the success of these programs should be maybe then evaluated in terms of, could we achieve these non-academic outcomes with some other means? If we think that this is politically expensive and heavy-handed approach, because there will be lots of political opposition and lots of social engineering to create results which don't in the end really change things that much. So I mean, should we almost conclude that perhaps segregation isn't that bad as we initially thought, and that we should perhaps use cheaper, more gentle means to achieve those non-academic changes?
Thank you, Panu. That's a really great question. So I would be maybe a little bit more nuanced in kind of what we could conclude from this. I think indeed there are interventions that can affect some of these non-academic outcomes, perhaps at a lower political cost. One of my co-authors, Elise Villery, she works specifically on some of these interventions, for example, that are designed to increase students' growth mindset, for example. And there are ways to do this without necessarily socially mixing the kids. However, I think for some dimension, it is much harder to achieve this without actually changing the social network. Typically, if we believe this Shetty et al. Result, that the share of high SES friends is a really big determinant of, for example, your upward social mobility, that could translate through many means that are, I don't think that academic outcomes is the only way in which, long-run trajectories could be influenced. Information, role models, aspirations, all of this could be influenced by networks. I think this typically cannot be changed without affecting the composition of the school. So I think we need to, for future research, I think it is important to first document how these effects translate into long-run outcomes. And then ideally but that's a longer research program, to try to separate what in these social outcomes matters the most for the long-run outcome. Because here it's still a kind of, a bunch of things. It is not clear whether it is, this growth mindset or the friends you've made that are going to be the most important. But you're right. I think this is a clear objective for the research for our research to answer.
We end this session here, I think. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you, Julien, for your very interesting presentation. And we will now to the lunch time. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Julien.
Thank you.